Let's get started. Story number 1.
The storm had come without warning, a wall of white swallowing the small mountain town of Wilder's Hollow. By noon, the streets were deserted, blanketed by a thick layer of snow that fell relentlessly from the slate-gray sky. The wind howled like a banshee, rattling windows and battering the rooftops of the tightly packed cabins. The old-timers in town said storms like this didn't happen often, but when they did, it was best to stay indoors and let it pass. Claire Dawson was one of the few who had ignored the warnings. She had spent most of her life in the city and had only recently moved to Wilder's Hollow after inheriting her late uncle's cabin. It was a modest place, tucked away on the outskirts of town, surrounded by dense pine forests. The idea of living somewhere so remote had been unsettling at first, but Claire was eager for a fresh start. She hadn't expected the isolation to feel so suffocating during the long winter months. When the power went out that afternoon, Claire cursed under her breath. She had been halfway through unpacking the last of her boxes, hoping to finally make the cabin feel like home. Now, the cabin was plunged into an eerie silence, save for the wailing wind outside. She grabbed her phone to check the weather app, but there was no signal. Typical, she thought. Resigned, Claire decided to light a fire in the hearth and wait it out. She gathered some logs from the pile her uncle had left by the fireplace and struck a match. The flames roared to life, casting flickering shadows across the room. It was warm, at least, and the glow of the fire made the cabin feel less oppressive. But as the storm raged on, the unease that had been simmering in her chest grew stronger. That was when she heard it, a faint knock at the door. Claire froze, her heart thudding in her chest. She glanced at the window but could barely see through the swirling snow. Who would be out in a storm like this? The knocking came again, louder this time. Cautiously, she approached the door. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling slightly. There was no response, just the sound of the wind. She unlocked the door and cracked it open, letting in a blast of icy air. No one was there. Only the storm greeted her, the snow piling high on the porch. Confused, Claire closed the door and locked it again, dismissing the noise as the wind playing tricks on her. But as she turned away, the knocking started again. This time, it wasn't at the front door. It was at the window. Claire's stomach dropped. Slowly, she turned toward the sound. The curtains were drawn, but she could see the faint outline of something or someone standing just outside. Her pulse quickened. She hesitated before pulling the curtain aside, but when she did, her breath caught in her throat. A child stood on the other side of the glass, his pale face pressed against the window. His eyes were wide and unblinking, his lips a shade of blue that made her stomach churn. He couldn't have been more than 10 years old, but there was something deeply unsettling about him. Claire fumbled to unlock the window and push it open. "What are you doing out here?" she demanded, her voice sharper than she intended. "You'll freeze to death." The boy didn't answer. He just stared at her, his eyes glassy and vacant. Claire leaned closer, reaching out to touch his shoulder, but the boy took a step back, disappearing into the snowstorm. "Wait," she shouted, climbing out of the window onto the porch. The snow came up to her knees, and the cold bit at her skin. She could barely see a few feet ahead, but the boy was gone. Frustrated and worried, Claire hurried back inside and slammed the window shut. She grabbed her coat and boots, determined to find the boy before he froze. But just as she reached for the door, the knocking started again. This time it was coming from the walls. Claire's breath hitched as the sound echoed through the cabin. It wasn't just knocking, it was scraping, like nails dragging against wood. She backed away, clutching her coat to her chest, her mind racing. Was this some kind of prank? Had someone followed her out here? The scraping grew louder, more insistent, moving from one wall to the next. Then, all at once, it stopped. The silence was deafening. Claire held her breath, waiting for something, anything to happen. And then she saw it. In the corner of the room near the fireplace, a dark figure began to take shape. It was as if the shadows themselves were coalescing, forming a humanoid shape that towered over her. Its presence was suffocating, its eyes two pinpricks of light in the darkness. Claire stumbled back, tripping over a chair and falling to the floor. The figure didn't move, but she could feel its gaze piercing through her. Her instincts screamed at her to run, but her body wouldn't obey. She was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. "Why are you here?" A voice rasped, low and guttural. It didn't come from the figure, it came from everywhere, reverberating through the cabin. I don't know," Claire stammered. "This is my uncle's cabin. I inherited it." The figure tilted its head as if considering her words. "He disturbed the peace," it said, "and now you have too." Claire's mind raced. Her uncle had always been a bit of a recluse, but he had never mentioned anything unusual about the cabin. "I didn't mean to," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'll leave if that's what you want." The figure didn't respond. Instead, it began to dissolve, the shadows dissipating like smoke. Claire felt a sudden rush of relief until she heard the boy's voice behind her. "Don't go outside." She spun around, but the boy was nowhere to be seen. His voice echoed in her ears, a chilling reminder that she wasn't alone. The storm outside grew fiercer, the wind screaming as if in protest. The walls of the cabin groaned, and Claire could feel the temperature plummet. She huddled near the fire, clutching a blanket and trying to calm her racing heart. As the hours dragged on, the noises returned. Footsteps above her, whispers in the corners of the room, and always the faint knocking like a heartbeat pulsing through the cabin. By the time morning came, the storm had passed, leaving behind a pristine blanket of snow. But Claire didn't feel relief. The events of the night had left her shaken, and she knew she couldn't stay there another night. She packed her belongings in a frenzy, desperate to leave before the sun set again. As she loaded the last of her bags into her car, she glanced back at the cabin one last time. It looked innocent enough, its snow-covered roof glistening in the sunlight. But Claire knew better. Just as she started the car, she noticed something in the snow. Footprints, small and barefoot, leading from the cabin into the woods. They couldn't have been hers, and they weren't there the night before. Against her better judgment, Claire followed the tracks into the trees, her breath visible in the frigid air. The footprints stopped abruptly at the edge of a frozen pond, and there, beneath the ice, she saw the boy. His face was pale, his eyes open and staring up at her. His hand was pressed against the ice, as if reaching for help. Claire stumbled back, her mind reeling. As she turned to run, she heard the knocking again. This time, it was coming from beneath the ice. Story the end.
Story number 2.
The snow began to fall just after sunset, soft at first, then heavier with every passing hour. By the time midnight rolled around, the entire town of Maplewood was buried under a thick, suffocating blanket of white. The winter storm warnings had been plastered across every news station for days, but no one had expected it to be this bad. Nina Harper stood by the window of the cabin she'd rented for the season, staring out into the swirling chaos. She had come here for solitude, to finally finish the novel she had been struggling with for years. Her editor had recommended the cabin, an isolated place deep in the heart of the woods. No distractions, he'd promised. Nina had laughed then. Now, standing alone in the dead of night, the only sound the howling wind and creaking wood, she wasn't so sure. The power had gone out an hour ago, plunging the cabin into an oppressive darkness. Nina had lit the fireplace, its amber glow casting flickering shadows across the room. She had tried to focus on her manuscript, but her fingers were too cold, her mind too restless. There was something about the storm that felt wrong. It wasn't just the storm. It was the cabin itself. From the moment she arrived, she had felt an undercurrent of unease, like she was trespassing somewhere she didn't belong. At first, she had chalked it up to her overactive imagination, a hazard of being a horror writer. But the little things had started to pile up. The way the door to the basement refused to stay shut. The faint smell of smoke that lingered in the air despite the fireplace being freshly cleaned. The way her laptop battery drained faster than it should, even when fully charged. And then there were the noises. At first, they had been easy to dismiss. The groan of old wood settling, the occasional thud as snow slid off the roof. But tonight, as the storm raged on, the noises felt deliberate. A creak of floorboards when she wasn't moving. A soft shuffle, as if someone or something was pacing just out of sight. Nina shook her head, forcing herself to focus. "You're being ridiculous," she muttered, pulling her sweater tighter around her. The fire hissed and crackled, the only source of comfort in the room. She grabbed her notebook, flipping through the pages in search of inspiration. But before she could jot down a single word, A loud thud echoed from the front porch. Her head snapped up. The sound was unmistakable, heavy and deliberate. Nina froze, her pulse quickening. She strained to listen, but the wind howled, drowning out everything else. Another thud, louder this time. It wasn't the storm. Someone or something was out there. She grabbed the flashlight from the mantel and inched toward the door, her breath shallow. The cabin's front door was old and heavy, with a small frosted window at eye level. Nina stood on her tiptoes, peering out into the storm. At first, she saw nothing but swirling snow. Then, a figure emerged from the blizzard, barely visible through the frost-covered glass. A man. He stood motionless on the porch, his head bowed, his body obscured by a long, tattered coat. His hat was pulled low over his face, and his gloved hands hung limp at his sides. He didn't knock, he didn't move, he just stood there. "Hello?" Nina called out, her voice trembling. "Are you okay?" The man didn't respond. Her heart raced. She thought about opening the door, but hesitated. Something about him was off. He should have been shivering, but he stood unnaturally still, as if the cold didn't touch him. "I'll call for help," she said, fumbling for her phone. But when she turned back to the door, he was gone. Nina gasped, her flashlight trembling in her hand. She hadn't heard him leave, hadn't heard footsteps crunching in the snow. He had simply vanished. The wind screamed, rattling the windows, and she backed away from the door, her mind racing. Maybe he'd wandered off. Maybe he'd fallen. She had to check, didn't she? What if he was injured? Against every instinct screaming at her to stay inside, Nina grabbed her coat and boots. She cracked the door open, the freezing air hitting her like a slap. The porch was empty, the snow undisturbed. There were no footprints, no sign that anyone had been there at all. She stepped outside, the snow coming up to her calves. The flashlight beam cut through the darkness, but all she saw was an endless expanse of white. Then she heard it. A voice, faint and distant, carried on the wind. "Nina." Her blood turned to ice. She whipped around, shining the flashlight in every direction. The voice was unmistakable, but it was impossible. No one knew she was here. No one. "Nina, help me." It was coming from the woods. She should have gone back inside, locked the door, and waited for the storm to pass. But the voice sounded desperate, pleading. Against her better judgment, she followed it. The trees loomed tall and skeletal, their branches swaying violently in the wind. The snow muffled her footsteps, and she moved slowly, her flashlight trembling. The voice grew louder, more insistent, leading her deeper into the woods. "Nina, please." Her breath came in ragged gasps, the cold air burning her lungs. The flashlight's beam flickered, and for a moment she was plunged into darkness. She smacked the flashlight against her palm, and the light returned, but what it illuminated made her freeze. A figure stood just ahead, barely visible through the snow. It was the man from the porch, his head still bowed, his hat casting a shadow over his face. But this time there was no mistaking it. His feet weren't touching the ground. Nina stumbled back, her scream swallowed by the wind. The man raised his head, and she caught a glimpse of his face, gray, hollow, with eyes that burned like dying embers. His mouth twisted into a grotesque smile, and he whispered her name again, though his lips didn't move. Her legs finally obeyed her, and she turned to run. The snow dragged at her boots, and she tripped, falling hard onto her hands and knees. When she looked back, the figure was gone. The cabin was in sight now, its faint outline barely visible through the storm. She scrambled to her feet, her flashlight flickering madly, and ran as fast as she could. The voice followed her, louder now, echoing through the trees. "Nina, you can't leave." She burst through the cabin door, slamming it shut behind her. Her hands shook as she locked it, bolting every latch. The fire in the hearth had burned low, casting long, sinister shadows across the room. She backed away from the door, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. And then she heard it again. The thud. But this time, it wasn't on the porch. It was coming from above her. The ceiling creaked, and Nina's eyes darted to the staircase leading to the attic. She hadn't been up there since she arrived, had no intention of exploring it. But now something was up there. The thudding grew louder, rhythmic, as if someone or something was pacing back and forth. Her flashlight beam danced across the staircase, and she swore she saw a shadow move. She wanted to run, to get in her car and drive away, storm be damned. But her keys were upstairs in her room, and the stairs to the attic were directly above the bedroom door. Her heart pounded as she crept toward the staircase, the flashlight barely steady in her trembling hands. The noises above grew more erratic, thuds, scrapes, whispers that made her skin crawl. As she reached the base of the stairs, she paused, steeling herself. Slowly she climbed, each step creaking beneath her weight. When she reached the top, the attic door loomed ahead, slightly ajar. "Nina," the voice came from inside, soft and raspy. She reached for the door, her hand shaking, and pushed it open. The attic was empty, but the window was wide open, snow blowing in and settling in a perfect circle on the wooden floor. At the center of the circle was a single wet footprint, small, barefoot, a child's. Nina stared at it, her mind reeling. She backed away, her flashlight darting across the room. She saw nothing. No shadow, no figure, just the wind and the snow. And then in the reflection of the window, she saw him, standing right behind her. Story the end.
Story number 3.
The storm had come in hard, the kind of blizzard that erased everything in its path, trees, roads, homes. By nightfall, the town of Greystone was buried, cut off from the rest of the world. It wasn't unusual for a storm to hit this hard in the dead of winter, but there was something about this one that felt different. The locals, the ones who had lived through decades of harsh winters, spoke in hushed tones about it. They said it felt like one of those storms. Maggie didn't understand what they meant, and she didn't care. She had come to Greystone for quiet and solitude after her divorce, renting a small, isolated cabin just outside the town limits. It had been a spur-of-the-moment decision, but it felt right, or at least it had, until tonight. The power went out just after 8 p.m., plunging the cabin into darkness. Maggie lit a few candles and huddled near the fireplace, her only source of warmth and light. She tried to read, but her eyes kept flicking toward the windows, which were now entirely frosted over. The sound of the wind was relentless, a low, mournful wail that seemed almost alive. Her phone had no signal, of course. She had tried calling for updates earlier in the day, but the storm had knocked out everything. She was completely alone, surrounded by an expanse of snow-covered wilderness. And yet, as the hours ticked by, she couldn't shake the feeling that she wasn't. It started with the knocking. At first, Maggie thought it was the wind, a faint tapping at the front door, rhythmic but soft. She ignored it, pulling the blanket tighter around her shoulders. But then it grew louder, more insistent. It didn't sound like the wind anymore. It sounded purposeful. Maggie set her book aside and stood, her heart thudding in her chest. "Hello?" she called out, her voice trembling. She edged toward the door, pausing just before reaching for the handle. The knocking stopped. She waited, straining to hear anything over the roar of the storm. When nothing happened, she let out a shaky laugh. It was just her imagination. She was jumpy, alone in a cabin in the middle of nowhere. Of course, she was imagining things. But as she turned to sit back down, the knocking started again. This time it wasn't at the door. It was at the window. Maggie froze, her stomach twisting. She turned slowly, her eyes locking onto the frost-covered glass. The candlelight flickered, casting strange shadows across the room. For a long moment, she stared, unsure if she should move closer or run. Then she saw it. A hand, pale and skeletal, pressed against the glass. Maggie let out a sharp gasp, stumbling back. The hand lingered for only a second before vanishing into the snow. Her mind raced. Was someone out there? How could anyone survive in this storm? Grabbing a flashlight, she forced herself to move toward the window. Her breath fogged up the glass as she peered out, but there was nothing there. No footprints in the snow. No sign of anyone, or anything. Her heart was pounding now, and her palms were slick with sweat despite the cold. "It's just the storm," she whispered to herself, trying to believe it. Just the storm. But deep down, she knew better. The hours dragged on, the storm showing no signs of letting up. Maggie tried to distract herself, but the cabin seemed to come alive with strange noises. Creaks and groans that couldn't all be explained by the wind. Shadows that seemed to shift and stretch in the corners of her vision. And always the faint sense of being watched. By midnight, she couldn't take it anymore. She decided to go to bed, hoping that sleep would bring some relief. She climbed the narrow staircase to the loft, where her bed sat beneath a sloped ceiling. The room was small and cold, the only light coming from the candle she carried. As she settled under the heavy quilt, she felt a little safer. The loft was small and enclosed, almost like a cocoon. But just as she was starting to drift off, the knocking returned. This time, it was louder, and it wasn't coming from the door or the window. It was coming from the roof. Maggie's eyes snapped open, her breath hitching. She lay completely still, listening as the knocking grew more erratic. It sounded like footsteps now, heavy and deliberate, pacing back and forth across the roof. She wanted to believe it was an animal, maybe a branch caught in the wind. But deep down, she knew that wasn't true. The weight of the footsteps, the deliberate rhythm, it was unmistakable. Gripping the quilt tightly, Maggie tried to calm herself. "It's nothing," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her heart. "It's nothing." The footsteps stopped. For a moment, the cabin was silent, save for the howl of the storm. Maggie held her breath, waiting. Then, with a deafening crash, something hit the roof directly above her. She screamed, bolting upright. The sound was so loud it felt like the roof was going to cave in. She grabbed the flashlight and scrambled out of bed, her legs trembling. The crash came again, followed by a low, guttural groan that seemed to reverberate through the walls. Maggie's flashlight flickered, and for a horrifying moment, she thought it was going to die. She stumbled toward the stairs, desperate to get to the main floor, to the fireplace and the light. But as she reached the top of the staircase, she froze. Something was standing at the bottom. It was a figure, barely visible in the flickering light. Tall and gaunt, with hollow eyes that seemed to glow faintly in the darkness, its head tilted unnaturally to the side, as if it was studying her. Maggie's scream caught in her throat. She backed away, her body trembling. The figure didn't move, but its presence was suffocating. "Who are you?" she managed to choke out. "What do you want?" The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised one long, bony finger and pointed at the front door. Maggie shook her head, tears streaming down her face. "No," she whispered. "I'm not going out there." The figure tilted its head further, as if confused by her defiance. Then it stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. Maggie turned and ran, her mind a blur of panic. She climbed back into the loft, slamming the door behind her. She could hear the figure below, its footsteps heavy on the creaking floorboards. She crouched in the corner, clutching the flashlight like a lifeline. The noises grew louder, footsteps, knocking, and that awful groaning sound. Then suddenly, it all stopped. Silence. For a long moment, Maggie didn't move. She didn't breathe. She waited, her ears straining for any sound. And then, just as she was beginning to think it was over, the loft door creaked open. The flashlight flickered again, and this time it went out completely. Maggie was plunged into darkness, her only company the sound of her own ragged breathing. And then, from the shadows, she heard it. A voice. Low and cold, barely more than a whisper. "You shouldn't have stayed." Story the end.
Story number 4.
The snowstorm came without warning. The forecast had mentioned flurries, maybe a few inches, but no one in the small town of Clearwater expected the blizzard that descended that night. Roads vanished under thick drifts, power lines sagged and snapped, and one by one, houses went dark. Sophie Grant stared out the frosted window of her late grandfather's cabin, watching the snow whip through the trees like ghostly tendrils. She had come up here to settle his affairs, sifting through old papers and memories after his passing last month. The cabin, nestled deep in the woods, had been his sanctuary for decades, but Sophie had always found it unnervingly isolated. Tonight, with the storm howling outside, it felt even more so. The power had gone out hours ago. The only light came from the fire she'd managed to coax in the stone hearth, its warm glow fighting the encroaching shadows. Sophie wrapped herself in a thick blanket and checked her phone for the 100th time. Still no signal. She set it down with a sigh, trying to push away the growing unease that had settled in her chest. The cabin was old, and the storm made it groan like a living thing. Every creak and pop of the wooden beams set her nerves on edge. She tried to focus on the book she'd brought, but her mind kept wandering. She couldn't stop thinking about the stories her grandfather used to tell, the ones he swore were true. He'd always been a storyteller, spinning tales about the woodwoods around the cabin. He'd speak of shadowy figures that appeared during the heaviest storms, of voices calling out from the trees. Sophie had laughed them off as a child, but now, sitting alone in the cabin, with the storm raging outside, she couldn't shake his words. Then it happened. A knock at the door. Sophie froze, her pulse racing. It was soft but deliberate, cutting through the howl of the wind. She stared at the door, her mind scrambling for an explanation. Who could possibly be out here in this storm? The knock came again, louder this time. She stood slowly, her blanket slipping to the floor. "Hello?" she called, her voice shaky. "Is someone there?" No answer. She grabbed the flashlight from the mantel and approached the door, every muscle in her body taut. Peering through the peephole, she saw nothing, just swirling snow and darkness. Taking a deep breath, she unlocked the door and cracked it open, the icy wind immediately slicing through her. "Hello?" She called again, louder this time. The porch was empty. No footprints disturbed the pristine snow. She stepped outside, her boots crunching on the wooden planks, and swept the flashlight across the yard. The beam caught only the endless white of the storm. Shivering, she retreated back inside and bolted the door. She tried to convince herself it was the wind, some trick of the storm, but her gut told her otherwise. Something about the knock had felt intentional. She returned to the fire, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. The minutes dragged by, and just as she was beginning to calm down, the knock came again. This time, it wasn't at the door. It was at the window. Sophie's breath caught in her throat. She turned slowly, her eyes locking onto the window nearest the fireplace. The frost-covered glass obscured the view, but she could see the faint outline of a hand pressed against it. She bolted upright, her heart hammering. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. The hand lingered for a moment before sliding away, disappearing into the storm. Sophie ran to the window, wiping at the frost with her sleeve, but there was no one there. Like before, the snow outside was undisturbed. Her mind raced. Was someone playing a prank? But who? The nearest neighbor was miles away, and the storm was too dangerous for anyone to be out in it. She paced the room, trying to think, when a faint noise made her stop dead in her tracks. It was a whisper. Faint, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. It came from outside, weaving through the wail of the wind. Sophie, her name carried on the storm. She backed away from the window, her chest tight. "Who's there?" she shouted, her voice breaking. "This isn't funny." The whisper came again, closer this time. "Sophie, help me." It sounded like a child. Against every instinct screaming at her to stay inside, Sophie grabbed her coat and boots. If there was a child out there, she couldn't ignore it. She pulled open the door, the storm nearly yanking it from her grasp, and stepped outside. The cold was brutal, stealing her breath and biting at her exposed skin. She shone the flashlight into the woods, the beam struggling to cut through the snow. "Hello," she called out. "Where are you?" The whisper came again, faint but distinct. This way. She followed it, her boots sinking deep into the snow. The storm seemed to close in around her, the wind screaming in her ears. The whisper led her deeper into the woods, away from the safety of the cabin. "Sophie," she stopped abruptly, the flashlight beam catching something ahead. A figure. Small and hunched, barely visible through the swirling snow. "Hey," she called, her voice trembling. "Are you okay?" The figure didn't respond. It just stood there unmoving. She moved closer, her flashlight shaking in her hand. "Do you need help?" she asked. The figure turned slowly and Sophie's stomach dropped. It was a child, a boy, no older than 8 or 9. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his eyes were hollow, black pits that seemed to absorb the light. He opened his mouth, but the voice that came out wasn't his. It was deep, guttural, and inhuman. "You shouldn't have come," Sophie screamed, stumbling backward. The boy took a step toward her, his movements jerky and unnatural. She turned and ran, the snow dragging at her legs. The cabin was a faint glow in the distance, her only hope of safety. The whispers followed her, growing louder, more insistent. "Sophie! Sophie!" She burst through the cabin door, slamming it shut and locking it. Her breaths came in ragged gasps, her body trembling. She pressed her back against the door, her eyes darting around the room. The fire had gone out. The cabin was pitch black, the only sound her own frantic breathing. Then from the darkness, she heard it. A single, deliberate knock on the inside of the door. Story the end.
Story number 5.
The snowstorm rolled in faster than anyone expected. By the time it hit, the entire town of Birch Hollow was buried under a suffocating blanket of white. Streets vanished, the horizon blurred, and the wind howled with a ferocity that made the windows shudder. The local radio station warned residents to stay indoors and off the roads, but for Evelyn Harper, the warning came too late. She was driving home from her parents' house in the neighboring town, determined to get back to her small cabin before the worst of the storm hit. The winding roads were treacherous in the best of conditions, and now they were nearly impossible to navigate. Her old Subaru groaned as it struggled through the snowdrifts, the headlights barely illuminating the dense flurry ahead. She glanced at the dashboard clock, 9:47 p.m. She should have been home by now, curled up with a book and a cup of tea. Instead, she was crawling along an unmarked road, the snow erasing any sense of direction. Her phone had lost signal miles ago, and the only company she had was the sound of the wind. Then her car sputtered. "No, no, no," Evelyn muttered, gripping the wheel tightly. The engine made a choking noise before it died completely, leaving her stranded in the middle of nowhere. She tried the ignition again, but it wouldn't turn over. The reality of her situation hit her like a gut punch. She was alone in the middle of a blizzard, with no way to call for help. For a moment she sat there, staring out at the snow-covered trees. She thought about staying in the car, waiting out the storm, but the cold was already seeping in. Her cabin wasn't far, maybe a mile or two through the woods. If she started walking now, she could make it before the temperature dropped too much. Bundling herself in every layer she could find, Evelyn grabbed her flashlight and stepped out into the storm. The wind was relentless, stinging her face and stealing her breath. She wrapped her scarf tighter and started trudging through the snow, each step an effort against the elements. The woods were eerily quiet, muffled by the thick snow. Her flashlight beam wavered, barely penetrating the darkness. Every now and then she thought she heard something, a branch snapping, the crunch of footsteps. But when she stopped to listen, there was only the wind. As she pressed on, the feeling of unease grew. The woods felt wrong, as if they were watching her. The snow seemed to absorb sound, creating an oppressive silence that made her heart race. She tried to shake off the paranoia, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other. And then she saw it. A light, faint and flickering, just ahead in the trees. Relief washed over her. Maybe it was another cabin, someone who could help her. She quickened her pace, stumbling through the deep snow toward the light, but as she got closer, her relief turned to confusion. It wasn't a cabin. It was a lantern, hanging from a low branch. Evelyn stopped, staring at the lantern swaying gently in the wind. It looked old, its glass cracked and frosted over. There were no footprints in the snow around it, no sign of how it had gotten there. She hesitated, her instincts screaming at her to turn back. But the cold was biting now, and the thought of shelter, any shelter, was too tempting. Taking a deep breath, she stepped closer. "Hello?" she called out, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Is someone there?" No answer. She reached out to touch the lantern, but before her fingers could brush the metal, the light went out. Evelyn jerked her hand back, her pulse racing. The darkness seemed to close in around her, and for the first time, she felt truly afraid. She turned to head back the way she'd come, but the path was gone. The snow had erased her footprints, and the trees all looked the same. Panic set in. She shone her flashlight in every direction, but the beam only revealed an endless expanse of white and shadow. She had no idea which way to go. Then she heard it. A voice, faint and distant, carried on the wind. Evelyn. Her blood ran cold. She turned slowly, her breath fogging in the freezing air. "Who's there?" she called, her voice trembling. The voice came again, closer this time. "Evelyn, this way." It sounded familiar, but wrong. Distorted, like a recording played too slow. She spun in circles, the flashlight beam shaking in her hands. "Stop it!" she shouted, her voice breaking. "This isn't funny." The woods fell silent. The only sound was her own ragged breathing. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she saw movement. A figure stood in the distance, barely visible through the snow. It was tall and thin, its features obscured by the storm. Evelyn's heart pounded as she took a step back. "Who are you?" she demanded, trying to keep her voice steady. The figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching her. Then, slowly, it raised an arm and pointed to the trees behind her. Evelyn turned, her flashlight trembling. The beam caught something in the snow, a trail of footprints leading deeper into the woods. But they weren't hers. They were too small, like a child's. Her stomach churned. She turned back to the figure, but it was gone. The storm seemed to intensify, the winds screaming through the trees. Evelyn felt the cold seeping into her bones, her limbs growing heavy. She had to keep moving, but every direction felt wrong. The woods had become a labyrinth, shifting and endless. The footprints in the snow called to her. She didn't want to follow them, but she didn't know where else to go. Her body moved on its own, her feet crunching through the snow as she trailed the tiny steps. They led her to a clearing. At the center of the clearing was a well, its stones covered in ice. The footprints ended at its edge. Evelyn stopped, staring down into the dark, gaping hole. The wind seemed to die down, the woods falling into an unnatural silence. Then the voice came again, echoing up from the well. Evelyn. Her legs buckled and she fell to her knees. The flashlight slipped from her hand, its beam illuminating the edge of the well. She crawled forward, her breath hitching in her throat. Peering over the edge, she saw nothing but darkness. But the voice continued, louder now, more insistent. Evelyn, come closer. A hand shot out of the darkness, pale and skeletal, grabbing her wrist. She screamed, pulling back with all her strength, but the grip was ice cold and unrelenting. The last thing she saw before the darkness swallowed her was the lantern, its light flickering back to life. Story the end.
Story number 6.
The snowstorm wasn't supposed to be this bad. That's what the weatherman said. A light dusting, maybe an inch or two. But by nightfall, the storm had turned vicious, a whiteout consuming everything in sight. The kind of storm that cut you off from the world. Lena was regretting her decision to stay in the old cabin. She'd inherited it from her uncle a few years back, a crumbling relic tucked deep in the woods of Vermont. She had spent the past week fixing it up, trying to make it livable again. It had been her uncle's sanctuary, but to Lena, it felt more like a tomb. The wind howled, rattling the shutters. She threw another log onto the fire, hoping to chase away the chill that seemed to seep from the walls. Outside, the world was nothing but swirling snow. She hadn't seen another soul in days, and her nearest neighbor was a good 10 miles away. She told herself she liked the solitude, but now with the storm bearing down, she felt small. Vulnerable. The cabin creaked and groaned like it was alive. Lena pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders and tried to focus on the book in her lap. But her eyes kept drifting to the window, the frosted glass shimmering in the firelight. She thought she saw movement out there, a shadow slipping between the trees. She shook her head, trying to dismiss it, just the wind playing tricks. And then she heard it. A faint knock. It was so soft she almost thought she imagined it. She froze, listening. The knock came again, louder this time. Her stomach clenched. Who could possibly be out there in this weather? She set the book aside and stood, her heart thudding in her chest. "Hello?" She called out, her voice uncertain. No answer. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the doorknob. "If someone's there, you need to speak up," she shouted. Still nothing. The knock didn't come again. Lena slowly backed away from the door, her skin prickling with unease. She told herself it was the wind or a branch scraping against the wood, but deep down she didn't believe it. She tried to go back to her book, but the words swam on the page. She kept glancing at the door, waiting for something to happen. An hour passed. The storm raged on, the wind howling like a living thing. Just as she was starting to relax, the knock came again. This time it wasn't at the door. It was at the window. Lena's breath caught in her throat. She whipped around, her eyes locking onto the frosted glass. For a moment she thought she saw a face, pale and ghostly, pressed against the pane. But when she blinked, it was gone. Her pulse raced. "Who's out there?" she demanded, her voice trembling. No answer. She grabbed the flashlight from the table and crept toward the window, her hands shaking. She shone the beam outside, sweeping it across the snow. Nothing. Just the endless white of the storm. She backed away, every nerve in her body on edge. She was starting to feel like she wasn't alone in the cabin, like the walls were closing in. She thought about her uncle, about the stories he used to tell her when she was a kid. Stories about the woods, about strange things that happened out here in the dead of winter. She'd always thought he was trying to scare her, but now she wasn't so sure. The hours dragged on, the storm showing no signs of letting up. Lena tried to stay awake, but exhaustion eventually got the better of her. She dozed off in the chair by the fire, her dreams restless and filled with shadows. She woke to the sound of footsteps. At first, she thought it was part of her dream. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she realized the sound was real. Someone, or something, was moving outside the cabin. Her heart pounded as she grabbed the flashlight and moved to the window. She shone the beam outside, her breath fogging up the glass. The snow was falling so heavily she could barely see, but there, just at the edge of the tree line, she saw it. A figure, standing still, watching the cabin. It was too far away to make out any details, but there was something off about it. Something wrong. It wasn't dressed for the cold, and it didn't seem to move, even as the snow piled up around it. Lena's hands trembled as she pulled the curtains shut. She backed away from the window, her mind racing. Was it just a person, lost in the storm? But why wouldn't they come to the door? Why were they just standing there? She decided she couldn't stay in the cabin. She needed to leave, to find help. She grabbed her coat and boots, throwing them on as quickly as she could. She opened the door, the icy wind nearly knocking her off her feet. The snow was waist deep, the cold biting into her skin. She started toward her car, but the storm had buried it completely. Panic set in. She didn't know what to do. She turned back toward the cabin, but something made her stop. The figure was closer now. It stood at the edge of the yard, motionless. She couldn't see its face, but she could feel its gaze on her. The air around her seemed to grow colder, the wind cutting through her like a knife. "Who are you?" she shouted, her voice shaking. "What do you want?" The figure didn't respond. It just stood there, silent and still. Lena backed away, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She stumbled toward the cabin, slamming the door shut behind her. She locked it, then dragged the heavy wooden table in front of it for good measure. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows. She huddled by the fire, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. She didn't know what she'd seen, but she knew it wasn't human. And then she heard the knock again. This time it came from inside the cabin. Lena froze, her blood turning to ice. The knock came again, louder, more insistent. It was coming from the door to the bedroom. She hadn't been in there since she arrived. The door had been shut the whole time. Her hands shook as she approached the door, the flashlight beam unsteady. She reached for the handle, then stopped. She didn't want to open it. She didn't want to know what was on the other side, but the knocking wouldn't stop. Taking a deep breath, she turned the handle and pushed the door open. The room was empty, just as she'd left it. The bed was untouched, the air cold and stale. But as she shone the flashlight around, her beam landed on something that made her stomach drop. Footprints. Small, wet footprints leading across the floor. They stopped at the window, where the frost had melted in the shape of a handprint. Lena backed out of the room, her pulse racing. She didn't know what was happening, but she knew she couldn't stay. She grabbed her coat and boots again, throwing open the door to the storm. She didn't care where she went, as long as it was away from the cabin. She stumbled through the snow, the wind whipping at her face. She didn't know where she was going, but she kept moving, driven by pure terror. And then she saw it. The figure was ahead of her, standing in the middle of the path. This time, it moved. It raised a hand and pointed back toward the cabin. Lena turned and ran, her breath coming in ragged gasps. She didn't stop until she saw the lights of a neighbor's house in the distance. She banged on the door, sobbing with relief when it opened. The neighbor, an older man named Henry, took one look at her and pulled her inside. "What the hell happened to you?" he asked, his voice filled with concern. Lena tried to explain, but the words wouldn't come. She spent the night on Henry's couch, too afraid to sleep. When morning came, they ventured back to the cabin together. The storm had passed, leaving a pristine, undisturbed blanket of snow. But when they reached the cabin, Lena stopped dead in her tracks. There, in the snow leading to the door, were footprints. Small, childlike footprints. They stopped abruptly, as if whoever made them had vanished into thin air. Story the end.
Story number 7.
The wind howled like a living thing, clawing at the windows of the cabin with icy fingers. The blizzard had rolled in suddenly, an enormous white wall swallowing the horizon as darkness fell. It was the kind of storm that silenced the world. A snowstorm so thick and relentless that even the nearest trees vanished into the void. Evan tightened his grip on the flashlight, the beam trembling as he moved through the old cabin. He hadn't planned to spend the night there. He hadn't even planned to find the cabin at all. But when his car skidded off the icy road deep in the woods and the storm made it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead, he stumbled across it as if by fate. Or bad luck. The cabin was ancient and abandoned, with a thick layer of dust coating every surface. The furniture was simple and sparse. A sagging couch, a rickety wooden table, and a stone fireplace that looked like it hadn't been lit in decades. But it was shelter, and Evan didn't have the luxury of being choosy. He wrapped himself in an old quilt he found draped over the couch and stared at the fire he managed to coax to life. The orange flames cast flickering shadows on the walls, shadows that seemed to dance and twist in the corners of his vision. Outside, the storm screamed, but inside, the cabin held a strange, heavy silence. It was the kind of silence that felt unnatural, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. Evan told himself he was imagining things, but as the hours crawled by, a sense of unease settled over him. The fire crackled, the wind howled, and somewhere, faint but unmistakable, he thought he heard a sound. It was distant at first, a soft scraping like something dragging across the floorboards. Evan froze, his breath catching in his throat. He held the flashlight tightly, the beam darting to the shadows pooling near the corners of the room. The sound came again, louder this time. It was coming from the far end of the cabin, near the kitchen. He rose slowly, his footsteps soft against the creaking wood. The cabin felt colder now, as if the fire's warmth was retreating, replaced by a chill that seeped into his bones. "Hello?" he called, his voice shaking. There was no reply. He edged closer to the kitchen, and the flashlight's beam cutting through the darkness. The sound stopped abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. And then the whispers began. They were faint, like wind slipping through cracks in the walls, but unmistakably human. Dozens of voices, overlapping and murmuring in a language he couldn't understand. They rose and fell like the ebb and flow of the storm, growing louder and more insistent. Evan's pulse quickened. His flashlight flickered, the light stuttering and dimming. "No, no, no," he muttered, shaking it desperately. The whispers stopped. The cabin plunged into silence once more, but it was different now. The air felt heavy, pressing against his chest and making it hard to breathe. And then, with a creak that echoed through the cabin, the door to the kitchen swung open. Evan's flashlight sputtered back to life, its beam landing on the open doorway. He hesitated, torn between his instinct to run and the irrational need to know what was happening. He stepped into the kitchen. The room was empty, but the temperature had dropped drastically. Frost rimed the windows, and his breath hung in the air like smoke. The old wooden table in the center of the room was coated in a thin layer of ice, and the shadows in the corners seemed deeper, darker. Something moved. Evan spun around, the flashlight catching a glimpse of something. A figure. Pale and gaunt, its eyes hollow and black. It disappeared into the shadows before he could fully register what he'd seen, but the impression of its face lingered in his mind. "Who's there?" he demanded, his voice trembling. The whispers returned, louder now, urgent and angry. They filled the room, echoing off the walls until it felt like they were coming from inside his own head. He clapped his hands over his ears, backing toward the door, and then the storm outside grew louder, the wind battering the cabin with renewed fury. Snow swirled through the cracks in the walls, spiraling into the room and forming a ghostly vortex. From within the vortex, the figure emerged again. It was clearer now, its features sharp and haunting. Its skin was deathly pale, almost translucent, and its long, tattered clothing swayed as if caught in an invisible wind. Its hollow eyes locked onto Evan, and for a moment the whispers stopped. "Leave," the figure said, its voice a chilling rasp. Evan stumbled back, his heart pounding. I didn't mean to come here. I just needed shelter." The figure tilted its head, a motion that seemed almost curious, but the air around it grew colder still. Ice crept across the floor, spreading toward Evan's feet. "This place is not for the living," the figure said. Before Evan could respond, the room erupted into chaos. The wind howled louder than ever, whipping snow and debris through the air. The figure advanced, its skeletal hands outstretched, and Evan turned and ran. He bolted back into the main room, slamming the door behind him. The whispers followed, echoing through the walls, and the fire in the hearth sputtered and died. The cabin was plunged into darkness, the flashlight barely illuminating the swirling snow and shadows. Evan's breath came in ragged gasps as he searched for a way out. But the storm outside was relentless, and the figure was closer now, its gaunt form emerging from the shadows like a nightmare made flesh. "I'm sorry!" Evan shouted, his voice breaking. "I didn't know." The figure raised a hand, and the whispers crescendoed into a deafening roar. Evan fell to his knees, clutching his head as the noise overwhelmed him. The air around him turned frigid, and the world seemed to tilt and spin. And then, as suddenly as it began, the noise stopped. The cabin was silent once more. The figure was gone, and the storm outside had abated, leaving a heavy stillness in its wake. Evan staggered to his feet, his body trembling. He didn't wait to see if the figure would return. He grabbed his coat and stumbled out into the snow, the remnants of the blizzard biting at his face. The forest was eerily quiet, the only sound the crunch of his footsteps as he made his way back to the road. When he finally reached it, his car was still there, half buried in snow. He didn't look back. It wasn't until he was miles away, the warmth of the heater finally seeping into his frozen limbs, that he dared to glance in the rearview mirror. The road behind him was empty, but for just a moment, he thought he saw a figure standing at the edge of the trees, its hollow eyes watching him leave. Story the end.
Story number 8.
It was the kind of snowstorm that left no room for mistakes. The roads were invisible, buried beneath layers of snow that the plows hadn't touched. The wind roared like a wild animal, carrying sheets of snow that turned the air into a swirling white chaos. Dana Parker knew better than to be driving in such weather, but she'd had no choice. Her grandmother, who lived alone in a remote cabin in northern Maine, had called earlier that day in a panic. "The storm's coming faster than they said," she'd rasped. "And something isn't right here, Dana. It's not just the snow, it's something else." Dana had tried to press her for details, but her grandmother had refused to explain. "Just come," she'd said before abruptly hanging up. The call left Dana rattled. Her grandmother, Eleanor, wasn't one to scare easily. She was pragmatic to a fault, a woman who had lived through blizzards, wild animals, and everything else life in the wilderness threw her way. If Eleanor was spooked, it had to be serious. By the time Dana got off work and packed her car, the storm had already begun. The 2-hour drive stretched into 3 as the snow thickened, blanketing the world in an impenetrable white. She hadn't seen another car in over an hour, and even with her high beams on, she could barely see 10 feet ahead. Her phone had lost service miles back, leaving her completely isolated. As she finally turned onto the narrow dirt road that led to her grandmother's cabin, the uneasy feeling in her gut grew stronger. The trees on either side of the road were heavy with snow, their branches bending under the weight. The wind howled through the forest, a mournful sound that seemed almost human. When the cabin's faint outline emerged through the snow, Dana felt a wave of relief. The single-story structure was dark, its windows black and lifeless. She parked her car and hurried to the door, her boots crunching through the snow. She knocked loudly, calling out, "Grandma, it's Dana!" No answer. She tried the doorknob, and to her surprise, it was unlocked. Pushing the door open, she stepped inside, shaking the snow from her coat. The cabin was freezing, the air inside as cold as it was outside. The fire in the wood stove had long since gone out, and the faint smell of smoke lingered in the air. "Grandma?" Dana called again, her voice echoing through the empty cabin. She flipped the light switch, but nothing happened. The power was out. Dana pulled out her flashlight and swept the beam across the small living room. Everything looked as it should. The worn plaid couch, the stack of books by the fireplace, the knitted blanket draped over the armrest. But there was no sign of her grandmother. A sudden noise made her freeze. It was faint, almost imperceptible, but distinct. A shuffle, like something being dragged across the wooden floor. It came from the back of the cabin, near the bedroom. "Grandma?" she called, her voice shaking slightly. The noise stopped. Dana's heart pounded as she made her way down the narrow hallway, the flashlight beam bobbing ahead of her. The bedroom door was slightly ajar, and she pushed it open slowly, her breath clouding in the cold air. The room was empty. The bed was unmade, the blankets tossed aside, as if Eleanor had left in a hurry. On the floor near the window, Dana noticed something strange. A trail of snow leading from the window to the doorway. as if someone or something had walked through the room with snow-covered boots. She stepped closer to the window, her breath catching in her throat. The frost-covered glass was smeared, as if someone had pressed their hands against it from the outside. But the strangest part was the footprints. They were small, far too small to belong to her grandmother, and they led out into the woods. Dana felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. She tried to tell herself it was just the storm playing tricks on her, but deep down, she knew something was wrong. Very wrong. She decided to check outside. Grabbing her grandmother's old lantern from the kitchen, she lit it and stepped out into the storm. The wind immediately tore at her, and she had to shield the flame with her hand to keep it from going out. The footprints were still there, leading away from the cabin and into the dense forest. They were spaced close together like a child's, and they didn't make sense. No child would be out here, not in this storm. And how had they gotten inside the cabin? Dana hesitated, every instinct screaming at her to stay put. But the thought of her grandmother out there, alone and scared, pushed her forward. She followed the footprints into the woods, her boots sinking into the deep snow with every step. The forest was eerily quiet, the snow absorbing all sound except the crunch of her footsteps. The wind howled through the trees, but it sounded distant, as if it were coming from another world. The footprints wound through the trees, leading her deeper into the woods than she had ever gone before. After what felt like an eternity, Dana reached a small clearing. The footprints stopped abruptly, right in the center of the open space. She shone the lantern around, her pulse racing. There was no sign of her grandmother, no sign of anyone. And then she heard it. A faint whisper, so soft she almost thought she imagined it. It came from the edge of the clearing, where the trees stood in shadow. The whisper grew louder, turning into a low, mournful wail that sent shivers down her spine. Dana, her name, spoken in a voice she didn't recognize. She spun around, the lantern shaking in her hand. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice breaking. The wailing stopped, replaced by a new sound, the crunch of footsteps in the snow. But they weren't hers. They were behind her. Dana whipped around, but there was no one there. The lantern's flame flickered, casting eerie shadows that danced across the trees. Her breath came in short, panicked gasps as she backed away, her eyes darting around the clearing. And then she saw it. A figure standing at the edge of the trees, barely visible through the snow. It was small, no taller than a child, and its features were obscured by the swirling flakes. But its eyes glowed. 2 pinpoints of pale, unnatural light. Dana's scream caught in her throat as the figure took a step closer. It didn't walk, it glided, its feet not disturbing the snow. The air around her seemed to grow colder, the storm intensifying as the figure drew nearer. "Dana!" It whispered again, its voice like the wind through the trees. She turned and ran, the lantern swinging wildly in her hand. She didn't know where she was going, only that she needed to get away. The forest seemed to close in around her, the trees twisting and bending as if trying to trap her. She burst out of the woods and stumbled back into the cabin, slamming the door shut behind her. Her chest heaved as she leaned against the door, her mind racing. She didn't know what she had seen, but she knew it wasn't human. The cabin was dark and silent, the only light coming from the dying fire. She tried to calm her breathing, to convince herself she was safe, but then she noticed something that made her blood run cold. The snow-covered footprints were back. They trailed across the floor, leading from the door to the center of the room. And there, standing by the fireplace, was the figure. It turned to face her, its glowing eyes locking onto hers. Its face was pale and hollow, its features blurred as if it were half-formed. It raised a hand pointing toward her, and the lantern's flame extinguished. Darkness swallowed the cabin. Story the end.
Story number 9.
The snow started falling just after noon, big, heavy flakes that stuck to everything. By the time Liam noticed the dark clouds swallowing the sky, he knew he had waited too long to leave. He was deep in the woods, miles from his car, with only the narrow hiking trail as his guide. What had started as a quick winter trek had turned into a race against the storm. The snow fell faster, blurring the landscape. Trees stretched endlessly in every direction, their branches heavy with white, and the trail became harder to see. Liam cursed under his breath, tightening his coat and pulling his scarf higher over his face. His boots crunched through the fresh snow, the sound muffled by the growing wind. It wasn't long before the trail vanished completely. The storm had swallowed it, leaving Liam disoriented. He turned in circles, looking for anything familiar, but the woods all looked the same, a wall of white and gray. The temperature dropped rapidly and the wind whipped around him, howling like a feral beast. Panic began to set in. His phone had no signal and his footprints were already disappearing under the fresh snow. He pushed forward blindly, hoping to stumble upon the road or at least some sign of civilization. But as the storm grew stronger, it became harder to see, harder to move. The cold gnawed at his fingers and toes, and his breaths came in shallow gasps. Just as he was beginning to think he might not make it, he spotted something through the haze of snow. A faint light. It flickered weakly, barely visible, but it was enough to give him hope. He trudged toward it, every step an effort as the snow rose past his knees. The light led him to a small cabin, tucked among the trees. It looked old, its wooden walls weathered and half buried in snow, but smoke curled lazily from the chimney, and the glow of firelight spilled through the frosted windows. Liam hesitated for a moment, uneasy about approaching a stranger's home uninvited, but the cold left him no choice. He knocked on the door, his frozen knuckles barely making a sound. "Hello?" he called, his voice shaky. The door creaked open on its own, revealing a dim interior. The fire crackled in the hearth, casting a warm, flickering light over the room. There was no sign of anyone inside. The furniture was simple, a wooden table, 2 chairs, and a small bed in the corner, neatly made. The air smelled faintly of pine and something else, something metallic, like blood. "Hello?" he called again, stepping inside. The warmth was immediate, wrapping around him like a blanket. He closed the door against the storm, shaking off the snow that clung to his coat. The cabin felt odd. It was too quiet, the kind of silence that pressed against your ears. The fire burned steadily, but there were no signs of recent activity. No dishes on the table, no boots by the door. Yet the fire hadn't started itself, and someone had to have lit the lantern hanging by the window. "Is anyone here?" Liam asked, his voice echoing in the small space. No answer. He moved closer to the fire, holding his hands out to warm them. The room grew still, the only sound the crackle of the flames. He was about to convince himself the cabin was abandoned when he noticed something on the table. A photograph. It was old, black and white, and slightly faded, showing a family of 4 standing in front of the cabin. The parents were stern-looking, their faces hard and unsmiling, while the 2 children, a boy and a girl, clung to each other, their expressions solemn. As he stared at the photograph, a sudden chill swept through the room. The fire dimmed, its warm glow flickering. Liam turned, his heart hammering. The cabin was empty, but the air felt heavier now, pressing down on him like a weight. He tried to shake off the feeling, telling himself it was just his imagination. But then he heard it, a faint, rhythmic sound, like footsteps crunching through snow. They were slow and deliberate, moving closer to the cabin. Liam froze, his breath catching in his throat. He moved to the window, wiping the frost away with his sleeve. Outside, the storm raged, the wind howling and snow swirling violently. But through the chaos, he saw them. Figures. They were faint at first, barely more than shadows moving through the snow. But as they drew nearer, their shapes became clearer. There were 4 of them, walking in a straight line, their heads bowed against the wind. They wore old-fashioned clothing, long coats and hats that looked like they belonged in another century. Liam's first thought was relief. Other people meant help, maybe a way back to safety. But as they came closer, something about them felt wrong. Their movements were too stiff, too mechanical, like puppets on strings. And their faces, when he saw their faces, his stomach dropped. Their eyes were black, completely black, like empty sockets staring out of pale, frost-bitten faces. Their skin was gray and cracked, and their mouths hung open, frozen in silent screams. Liam stumbled back from the window, his mind racing. The figures stopped just outside the cabin, their heads tilting upward as if they could see him through the frosted glass. The air inside grew colder, the fire sputtering and nearly going out. He backed away, his hands shaking. The photograph on the table caught his eye again, and his stomach churned. The family in the picture, they looked just like the figures outside. A loud bang echoed through the cabin, making him jump. It was the door rattling on its hinges as if something was trying to force it open. The banging grew louder, more frantic, and the whispers started. Soft at first, like the wind, but growing louder, more insistent. They were all around him, surrounding him, whispering in a language he didn't understand. Liam grabbed a chair, holding it in front of him like a shield. "Stay back," he shouted, his voice cracking. The whispers stopped abruptly. The door swung open, and the storm roared into the cabin. Snow and wind whipping through the room. But the figures didn't enter. They stood in the doorway, their hollow eyes fixed on him. One of them, a woman, stepped forward. Her mouth moved, but the words didn't match the sound. Instead, the whispers returned, louder now, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You shouldn't be here," the voices said, overlapping and echoing. I didn't mean to trespass," Liam stammered. "I just needed shelter." The woman tilted her head, her black eyes unblinking. "This is not your place." The wind howled louder, and the other figures moved closer, their stiff, unnatural movements making Liam's skin crawl. The whispers grew deafening and the temperature plummeted. Frost crept along the walls and floor, and Liam's breath came out in frozen clouds. He stumbled toward the fire, desperate for warmth, but it was dying, the flames shrinking until only embers remained. The figures stepped inside, their presence sucking all the heat from the room. The woman reached out a hand, her fingers impossibly long and thin, tipped with nails like icicles. "Leave," the voices commanded, their tone shifting to something darker, angrier, or "join us." Liam didn't need to be told twice. He bolted for the door, pushing past the figures and plunging into the storm. The snow blinded him, the cold biting into his skin, but he ran, his only thought to get as far from the cabin as possible. The whispers followed him, carried on the wind, and when he glanced back, he saw the figures standing at the edge of the trees, watching. Their black eyes seemed to glow, piercing through the white haze. Liam ran until his legs gave out, collapsing in a snowdrift. The storm had eased slightly, and through the swirling snow, he saw the faint glow of headlights. A snowplow was making its way down the road, its driver stopping when he saw Liam. He was pulled into the cab, wrapped in blankets and bombarded with questions, but all he could do was point toward the woods and mutter, "The cabin." The driver frowned. "There's no cabin out there, just trees for miles." Liam didn't argue. He didn't look back. It wasn't until days later, when he was safe and warm in his apartment, that he decided to search for answers. He found an old article about a family who had lived in those woods nearly a century ago. A brutal snowstorm had trapped them in their cabin, and none of them survived. Their bodies were found frozen, their faces twisted in fear. The article included a photograph. It was the same one Liam had seen on the table. Story the end.
Story number 10.
The snowstorm hit suddenly. One moment, the forecast was calling for a light dusting. The next, the wind picked up, howling through the trees and whipping the powder into thick white curtains. By the time it was truly dark, the entire world had vanished behind the snow. Roads were buried, houses disappeared into the blanket of white. The weather service was warning of a severe blizzard event, and people were urged to stay home. It wasn't the first time I'd been caught in a storm like this. I grew up in a small town in the mountains of northern Wyoming, and I'd seen enough winter weather to last a lifetime. But this one was different. It wasn't the kind of snowstorm you'd shake off and move on from. The kind that got under your skin and made the hair on the back of your neck prickle. I was visiting my childhood home for the weekend. My parents had recently moved out, leaving me to deal with the old cabin by myself. I didn't mind the solitude, but something about the house always made me uneasy. It was a small, wood-paneled structure, the kind you might expect to see on a postcard, but the space always felt colder than it should. Even in the warmer months, there was an odd chill in the air. Something about the house, or maybe just the memories tied to it, that made you feel watched. The storm picked up quickly, so I decided to hunker down inside and wait it out. My plan was simple: make some soup, watch a few old movies, and ignore the eerie feeling that had settled into the house. Around 8 o'clock, the power flickered. It wasn't unusual. The weather had been getting worse for hours, and the heavy snow had weighed down power lines. I wasn't overly concerned at first. I lit a few candles around the house to give me some light, and continued to stir the soup on the stove. But then the wind began to wail. Not the typical winter gusts, but something deeper, almost like a voice in the storm. I stood frozen, the spoon in my hand still, listening. It sounded like a cry, a low, sorrowful wail. At first, I thought it was the wind bending the trees just outside the house, but the longer I listened, the more I realized it was too distinct, too human to be the wind. I stood there for a few moments, waiting for it to stop, but it didn't. The wail continued, rising in intensity with each passing second until it seemed to fill the entire house. I dropped the spoon on the counter and hurried to the window. Outside, there was nothing but snow. The blizzard had turned the world into a void of white. It was impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. The sound came from somewhere in the woods behind the house, far beyond the reach of the backyard. I was about to pull away from the window when I saw someone standing at the edge of the tree line. A figure, too tall and thin to be human, silhouetted against the storm. Its arms hung loosely at its sides, and its head turned slowly toward the house, as if it knew I was watching. I recoiled, stumbling back away from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. There was no way anyone could be out there in this storm. It was impossible. And yet, there it was. The figure didn't move. It stood perfectly still, just outside the light cast by the house. I felt as though it were watching me, waiting. I froze, too terrified to blink, my mind racing with irrational thoughts. But then the wail came again, louder this time. It echoed through the air, hollow and mournful. My stomach turned. This wasn't a person. I grabbed my phone, desperate to call for help, but there was no signal. The storm had taken out the cell towers, leaving me alone with whatever that thing was outside. My hands were shaking, and I pressed myself closer to the wall, away from the windows, not knowing what to do next. I felt a sudden compulsion to go outside, but I didn't want to. Something deep in my gut told me it was a terrible idea, that if I went out there, I wouldn't come back. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I had to see it. It was the kind of feeling that whispered at the back of your mind, coaxing you to do something you knew was wrong. I pulled my jacket on, grabbing a flashlight from the kitchen counter. The wind howled through the gaps in the cabin's doorframe as I opened the back door. The snow slammed into me, blinding me for a moment. I squinted through the flurry, pointing the beam of the flashlight into the woods, but the beam barely made a dent in the swirling white. I stepped out, the crunch of snow underfoot, muffled by the wind. I was standing in the middle of the yard when I heard it again, the wail. But this time, it wasn't just from the woods. It was closer, behind me. I spun around, the flashlight beam shaking in my hand. For a moment, I saw nothing. But then, in the dim light, something caught my eye. A figure, hunched down low to the ground, creeping across the snow. It was so close now that I could see its outline, the faint reflection of moonlight catching its twisted features. Its face was too pale, almost translucent, and its eyes were wide and black as if they were absorbing the light around them. My heart leaped into my throat as I backed away. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. My breath came in short gasps and my feet were frozen in place. The figure moved toward me, slowly but with a strange, unnatural grace. It wasn't walking. It glided across the snow, its body bending and twisting unnaturally as it came closer. I could see it now, its mouth stretched open, impossibly wide, as if it were waiting to swallow me whole. I turned and ran, not looking back. The snow was deeper now, and each step seemed to pull me further down into the cold. I could hear the thing behind me, the sound of it scraping across the snow, dragging itself closer with every passing second. I reached the cabin door and slammed it shut behind me, but I wasn't alone. The thing was inside. I could feel it in the air. The temperature had dropped further, and the walls seemed to shudder with the presence of something dark and wrong. It was no longer outside. I couldn't hear it, but I could feel its cold breath, like a whisper against my neck. I backed away from the door, my heart hammering. The house felt too small now, too constricting. There was nowhere to hide. The lights flickered again, this time going completely out. I was plunged into darkness, the sound of my own breathing the only thing I could hear. But then, there was a new sound. Slow, deliberate footsteps across the floorboards. I wasn't alone. The footsteps were coming closer. I scrambled for the door, but as I reached for the handle, the wail came again. Closer this time, almost right behind me. I couldn't breathe. The air had turned thick and suffocating. I turned quickly, but no one was there. But I could still feel it. Then a voice whispered from the corner of the room, "Leave." It wasn't my voice. It wasn't anyone's voice that I recognized. I didn't wait. I ran outside again, through the door, back into the blinding snow. I ran until my legs gave out, until the world around me became nothing but white. When I woke, I was lying on the snow, my face frozen against the ground. The storm had passed, and the world was still again. The snow was undisturbed. There was no sign of what I had seen, but I could feel it in my bones. Whatever it was, it had been real. I never returned to that cabin. I couldn't bring myself to. The storm, the wail, the figure. I don't know what I saw that night, but I've never forgotten it. And I don't think I ever will. Story the end.